let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, tonight, as we open your word and again partake of what you have for us, I pray, Lord, you'll anoint that word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things you'd have to be said, and then anoint our hearts that we receive what you have for us. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, tonight we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and this cliffhanger, as my wife was telling me. We're going to see about the second banquet that Esther gave for the king and Haman. So let's start reading Esther chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. That night the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the record of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." All right, so after Esther's first banquet, and you'll remember that first banquet, he was looking forward to hearing what her request was. She had risked her life to come into the inner court, and he had, gave her the scepter and had her come in and ask what she wanted, and she said, "I just want to have a banquet." Well, he was smart enough to know that wasn't what she wanted. There was some other thing, something else of real importance. And so he was no doubt anxious to find out what that was. Also, these banquets, as we talked last week, the first half of the banquet, first course would be meat and water, and then the second course would be dessert with lots of wine. And so he probably had drank a lot of wine in that banquet. And of course, when he asked her what she wanted, she simply said, "Well, I want you to come to another banquet tomorrow. And we're going to do this all over again tomorrow. Maybe today we had chicken and tomorrow we're going to have roast beef." I don't know how she changed the menu. But the next day they were going to have another menu, another banquet again. And when you look at all the drinking and all that went on, you would think that Ahasuerus would fall asleep and just be out. That would be the normal reaction, for somebody who does a lot of drinking or whatever. They usually either pass out or, they're ready for bed. That's it. But he couldn't sleep. Unusual. It was unusual physically, and he was a heavy drinker, so, you would think he was used to it. It wouldn't anything like that. So why was it he couldn't sleep? And we're not told why, but what we do know is that it was in the divine will of God that he not sleep. And then, which to me, well, I can kind of understand this. He called for his night. Evidently, they had somebody, probably a servant, that was awake all night to oversee the king. And if he woke up and wanted a glass of water, hey, he'd run and get him a glass of water. So you had a servant, one of the eunuchs probably, that had night duty. And the king couldn't sleep, so he called in his night duty. He wouldn't want to call him a nurse really, but called him in and said, I need to have you go get the record of the Chronicles. And I need that to be read to me. Now, if I can't sleep, probably the last thing I'm going to want to try to do is figure out chronicles or records of or history. I'm probably going to go get a novel, or I'm going to go get something else, poetry, something, But he wanted these chronicles. Now, it was a custom in those days that wherever the king went, whether he was sitting on his throne, whether he was off on a campaign or something, there were scribes that went with him. And they recorded every major event, or every event that needed to be recorded, I'll put it that way. It didn't have to be a major event, just something that happened that was of interest or could be of interest in the future. So, the Persians especially were very much into this. And we see evidence of this in the Word where, Nebuchadnezzar, we talk about the three Hebrew children and what he said and all that went on. How did anybody know about that? Because he had a scribe with him that was, quickly trying to, write this stuff down so it would be held for posterity. And the Persians especially were very much interested in the Chronicles, because this was a history that went back not only through the Persians, but it went to through the Medes, and before them the Babylonians, and it was a record of everything that had happened in the royal lineage of these different nations that came together in the Persian Empire, eventually worked its way into that. And so the kings would read this and they could learn. It was a way of capturing history and learning how some other ruler 100 years ago maybe handled the situation, and so they could then see how that turned out, and they could figure out if that would work or not. Because these guys, we often think of them just being as despots. They're just out there, living it up and getting drunk and having a good time and letting everybody go jump in the lake. But they were really professional politicians. And they did spend a lot of time trying to see the mistakes and the successes of their successors. And they tried to apply that stuff. Because, even though human nature is for us just to go off and do things, the reality is that even though, he didn't have to, from the political standpoint, he didn't have to worry about anybody, he didn't have to think about anybody else, he could just think about himself. But the reality is, if he didn't, he wouldn't be here very long. And because in those days, if you didn't live very long. And you see that in the history of the kings from Israel. Those that were evil kings, look and see how long they lived. Unless they had extremely good bodyguards to protect them. So it was imperative on them that they, we would call it today, that they have social responsibility. In other words, that means they tended to society, and they tried to satisfy, at least to some degree, society. And the Persians were very good at this, by the way. They were very good at it. So, he had these records, and I don't know how far they went back. Some of them, they have found some of these that go back generations, so there was probably a lot of information in there. So he had the books read to him, rather than reading them himself. Now, there's a couple of interesting thoughts about this that I found. One of them is that maybe he couldn't read. And as some of the Persian rulers, or not just Persians, but in that time frame, they couldn't read. They were never taught to read. They weren't educated like, today we think about royalty and they have the best education. In those days, they were educated how to fight, how to lead people, but they weren't really educated in things like reading. That doesn't mean they couldn't read at all, but they would be able to read to some degree, but just enough to get by. They weren't really well educated. In this case, I'm not sure about that one. The Persian kings usually were pretty well up on things, so I would think he could probably read. But the other one was what I think is probably more or closer to what he was thinking, and that is, when you have somebody read to you, especially if it's a man who has a, you know, like a good rich voice, and he's reading to you, it doesn't take very long before, you know, you kind of just doze off and that drone, and before long you're asleep. So he was maybe thinking, you know, there's nothing any more boring than reading the Chronicles. Maybe this will put me to sleep, you know. And I kind of, I read that and I got to, well, that makes perfectly good sense to me. If I can't sleep, the last thing I want to do is try to learn something, you know, reading something. It just doesn't work. So this may have been what was going on here. We'll never know, of course. And it also may have been that Ahasuerus considered himself below that position, that his position was, it would be beneath him, in other words, to read to him, to actually read himself. And it would be easier to have somebody else read it to him, and you know, it would be beneath him to actually do something like that. And that's another thought. You know, it's just things we'll never know. But what we do know is that they were reading the book. And from what it looks like, the way this whole thing is written, of course we don't know when he asked for the books, but it looks like they read almost the whole night. So if he was planning on putting him to sleep, it didn't seem to work very well. And actually, this would of course happen if God wanted him to find out about Mordecai, and they started at the beginning. They're going to be all night before they get to the story of Mordecai. And God would, of course, keep him awake. But this is one of those instances where we don't see God mentioned in this book. We don't see any honor given to him. We don't see anything about God. And yet we can very clearly see through all the events how God was actually there. He was actually moving and causing a man who was a pagan ruler to not sleep, to call for the books, and then to remain awake until they found the portion that God wanted him to hear. And I don't know, to you, I don't know about you, but to me this is encouraging. Because if God does that for the Jews of that time and affects a man like Ahasuerus, how much more does he do for us? And even though we don't see it, we don't maybe understand it, we can't see the big plan, and maybe we don't put God in it at all. But God is there, and he's doing something as simple as keeping somebody awake. You just have, you know, I mean, we really think about it. He could have just put on a theophany, walked in, passed all the guards, and stood up as Azarias and say, "Hey, Azarias, let me tell you what's going on." That would have been easier, would have been more sure, would have scared him to death. He would have treated the Jews much better, I'm sure. But it wasn't in the plan of God. And so sometimes we think God should do things certain ways, but he has a plan. And when you think about it, if he'd have done that, what kind of story would we be reading? Would it have been as interesting as this book is about how Esther came to the throne and all the things that happened? All right. Now, while he was reading, came across that section about how Mordecai had found the two chamberlains, had discovered they were going to, they were planning to kill the king, and had told the queen. Now, you know, there's one little part of this whole story about Mordecai and all that happened that is missing, and that was, what was the king's reaction when he found out that Mordecai had told her about the plot? Because she was not supposed to have any contact with men other than the eunuchs. It doesn't say. He probably or possibly just assumed that it had come through one of the servants to her ear, except she specifically said, if you go back and read it, she said it came from Mordecai. And yet he doesn't seem to be too concerned about that. Just an interesting little side piece there that I've been thinking about. I think about strange things. All right, so we found out that no reward had been given to Mordecai. Now, it was common in the Persian Empire that royal benefactors formed a distinct class and had their names inscribed on a special list. So anybody that supported the king in unusual ways, wasn't just donating money, but in this case Mordecai saved his life. It may have been somebody who gave something very special to the king. You know, these were considered the benefactors, and they belonged to a special class of people in the Persian Empire. They were treated differently, and they had their names put on this list. And if their name was on that list, you better not mess with them, because these were considered special people in the empire. And so the king says, what happened, to Mordecai? What did we do for him? And they said, we didn't do anything for him. That was interesting, because first place, why didn't the king himself follow up on what Mordecai did? In fact, it even seems like maybe he had completely forgotten about him until he read it in the book. Why would that happen? It was his responsibility to see that his benefactors were honored. And in this case, he dropped the ball. So there was probably a little bit of that, oops, what did I do? How did I not do this? Because it was part of the law, by the way, part of the Persian law. So, he may have also assumed that one of the high officers of the court had taken care of it. And of course that would stand to reason, because the king is busy. And you would think one of the high officers in the court would take care of this. So there's some conjecture that the high officers may have known that Mordecai was a Jew. And there was a certain amount of animosity. And, they were prejudiced against him. Others think it might have been that Haman, it would have been his responsibility, because he had that high position, to honor Mordecai. And of course, he simply wasn't going to do it. So that's just two conjectures that I've read that kind of shed a little bit of light on that. Oh, there is a third one also, that any of the officials in the court would be rather hesitant to officially recognize Mordecai, because they knew Haman hated him. And Haman held a higher position, so there could have been the fear that in doing that, they would suffer at the hands of Haman. Because I'm sure they all knew what kind of a man he was. All right. So, since it was the duty of the ruling monarch to see that all these people received their honor, it needed to be corrected as soon as possible. So, let's read verse 4. So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So let me set this for you. It's early in the morning, And we know from last week that Haman's friends and his wife suggested that he go to the king early in the morning and suggest hanging Haman, and then he could go merrily along with the king to Esther's banquet. It was also the who?
Mordecai.
Oh, hang Mordecai?
Yeah.
Yes, going to hang Mordecai, not Haman, it's Mordecai. Anyway, then he could go on to, merrily along to the banquet. Now, it was the custom in those days, because of the tremendous heat, and even here it's hot, and so you see people out early in the morning working in their gardens or waiting till late at night just before dark to go out and do something in the yard because of the heat. Well, you can imagine there the intense heat that's there and the high humidity. They wanted to get all of their official duties over early. Because you remember the kings, they wore these big robes and all of that stuff, for all of their official stuff. They wanted to get that off just about as much as we do. Get into something cool. So, they would have they would visit with whoever, have the official stuff early in the morning. So, this must have been extremely early because the king said, who is in the outer court? Who's waiting to come and see me? And the only one they mentioned was Haman. So he evidently had come before everybody else. He wanted to be the first one on the docket. Kings had a good night's sleep, and hey, we're going to go party in a little bit, so this is what I need. And so they said, Haman's out there. Well, this is one of the times Haman probably shouldn't have been out there so early for his own good. But there he was. Those with the most urgent matters would have come early to have the best chance of speaking to the kings. So the servant, it's interesting, and you can kind of see a little nuance in here, and when you read the rest of the story, I don't think the servants of the king were too pleased with Haman. I don't think they thought he was such a great guy. Maybe the king did. But quite often these servants knew far more about people than the king did. And we'll find more about that as we go along. They really knew what was going on, and I don't think they really cared much for him. They knew he hated Mordecai, and we'll find that out in a little bit. And so when they went out into the court, look who's there. And they knew that whatever was coming was going to be to honor Mordecai. And so, there's Haman. Hey, King Haman's out there. I can see him saying this with a big smile because they could probably see what was going to happen. Haman's in there. So he says, well, bring Haman in. Allow him to come in. Now that simple let him or allow him to come in tells us a little bit more about court life. Even though Haman was second in command, he had to wait in the court to be ushered into the intercourt for the king to say, yeah, come on in. So it looks like there was maybe two waiting areas. There's one at the gate for regular officers, and then one in the outer court where somebody of Haman's prestige, high officers, they would be in the outer court. And I kind of look at it maybe like in the airport, us schmucks go to the airport and we sit in a chair out there someplace and, watch people go by. But if you're really first class, you go into the lounge and you sit down where it's nice and they serve you. You can have whatever you want. You can have an extra large bag of peanuts or something. Well, that may have been the case here, is how their court life worked. But he could not come in until he was invited in. And I can just kind of see Haman, he's out there, and they say, the king will see you. Oh boy, now's my chance, you can just see the excitement. He's going to get rid of Mordecai, finally. So, he gets ushered into the king. Verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Yes. Before Haman had a chance to bring up the plan that he had and ask for the king's permission, the king says, hey, what should we do for somebody that I, the king, really want to honor? Now I think we need to kind of step back and look at the reasoning here Haman may have had for his thoughts. Haman had just been promoted to the highest position in the Persian court. He was right next to the he had, it looks like, pretty much free reign to come into the king whenever he wanted. He just came to the outer court and he was ushered in. He had that he had the king's ear, if you would. Yesterday, the queen had put on a banquet in honor of Haman, in which it was only the king and Haman. So Haman, in his egotistical way of thinking, well, if the queen gave me a banquet, surely the king has got a... Because the banquet, while it wasn't public, it certainly was well known that this was a banquet for Haman. You know, the servants and everything, this word got out. Haman, oh, the queen just gave a great banquet for him, and she's going to give him another one today. That makes him really important. So he was probably thinking, the king has got to best this some way. How can the king best this banquet? I got an idea. And so he relays to the king his idea. So this was done, by the way, on the spur of the moment. And I think this kind of shows his self-importance, egotism, and his just... He was bigger than life as far as he was concerned. And so he says, first thing, let a royal robe be brought out that the king has worn. Now, the royal robe would have been a robe made of purple interwoven with gold. And this is according to Justin and Curtis. And under ordinary circumstances, it would have been a capital offense to put on any garment that the king had worn. That was a capital offense according to Persian law. So the first thing he asked for would have been against the law. But nobody else would have had that honor. All right, secondly, take one of the king's horses. Now, they had a lot of horses. But take one of the king's horses that had a royal crest on its head, And this would be provided to this man of honor to ride through the streets of the city. Now, Persia was a country of horses, and the king's horse would have been a hybrid charger. You know, this wasn't just some horse they went out to an auction and picked up. These king's horses were probably special bred, just on special farms, you know, with just, you know, it's like we do today with race horses. The reason that people, these trainers want to win the Kentucky Derby or the, you know, the Preakness or the Triple Crown is because, not because the horse is, you know, so great, but it's because after they win it, they put it out to pasture and they charge stud fees. And stud fees can be up to $1 million, depending on the horse. Because it's a horse that wins. It's a horse that has all the qualities people are looking for. And so this was how they bred these horses for the Persian rulers. And of course, over time, these horses just became absolutely amazing horses. You can read, you know, of course, being involved with horses for years, you pick up things about some of these horses, but they were huge, beautiful horses who were not afraid. You know, they were just muscular and they just would run right over everything. And we see today the antediluvians horses, those beautiful white horses, you know, that they dance and they jump in the air, and they can do things that normal horses don't do, but they've been bred to do it. And these were actually military horses and have been raised for that in Europe for years. So this is just one of the examples. So he was take one of these horses, and it made sure it had that royal crest on the front, which was an ornamentation that designated the animal as belonging to the king. Now everybody who was in the citadel or in the city was probably very much aware of what the king's horses looked like. And when one of those horses came out, that's one of the king's horses. That's one of the king's horses. Well, for anybody to have jumped on the back of one of the king's horses, it was immediate death. So, first of all, the robe was against the law. The horse was against the law. So Haman was really getting out there, you know. Nobody else has ever done this, but the king will give it to me. It's interesting that this honor that Haman came up with was very similar to the honor placed on Joseph after he had interpreted Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh placed a signet ring on his finger, placed fine linen on him, and put a gold chain around his neck. He then rode in the second chariot that belonged to Pharaoh throughout the land, and everyone was commanded to bow when he rode past. Kind of interesting, but it shows this widespread idea of how to honor somebody in those early days. And Joseph, by the way, that became, while it was the Pharaoh's second chariot, it was his first chariot. And when you read on, he actually rode this all the time. So wherever he went, he had the king's chariot. And wherever he went, people had to bow down. Well, look at Haman. The king edicted that every time Haman walked by, everybody had to bow down. Of course, Mordecai didn't do it. So, you know, it's very, very similar. And you see that story, by the way, in Exodus chapter 41. He then went on to say, let one of the noblest princes or officers of the court, let him put the robe on this man of honor and put him on the horse and then lead him through the city. It says here, you know, to lead him through the city square. Actually, what it actually meant was to lead him down the main thoroughfares or main routes within the city. So this walking through the city would have taken a few hours. It wasn't something you just go out in the city square and make a loop and come home. You had to be out there for some time in order, because they had, very much like today, you know, on New Year's Day, not everybody, you turn on at 8 o'clock and you turn on the Rose Parade, you know, and you see. What people don't realize, because they only see about 2 blocks. Now this is somebody that can tell you, because I marched that thing in a band when I was in high school. The parade route is 5 miles long. There is a mile at the beginning that you have to get started, and 2 miles at the end that you have to march to get back to where your buses are parked. So it was not a, you know, 5-minute in front of the camera parade. You were there before sunup, and you were ready to go when that parade kicked off at 8 o'clock. You have to have already walked the mile, you know, and you're in, you know, I won't go into all of it, but it's quite an experience, and one that I still treasure today, because it's something not many people get to do. But walking down that route, and our particular band was one of the best bands in Southern California. We had 120 that we marched. We started playing the mile before we got there, and we didn't stop playing until the 2 miles were in at the end. Some of those guys would march, and then they'd wait, you know, 3 or 4 blocks, 5 blocks, and then they'd play a little bit and then march a few. You never saw us that we weren't playing. Maybe for just 3 or 4 minutes we'd put them down because we had a change of cadence, and you know, we'd wait for the drums to get, and then we'd do it again. And it was funny because, just a little anecdote, we had the Marine Band in front of us and the Salvation Army behind us, and by the time we got done with the 5 miles, the Marine Band was having a hard time picking up their instruments, and they were not about to play any longer, and the Salvation Army was in worse shape, so we thought we were pretty good. We're still playing, and we're still having a blast. Of course, we're high school. But, you know. Anyway, all right, so let's get back. I get sidetracked sometimes. So this man was supposed to, notice it had to be one of the highest officials. One of the highest. Now, James Fawcett Browning says this: on grand and public occasions, the royal steed is led by the highest subject through the principal streets of the city, a ceremony which may occupy several hours. So that was from St. James. James Fawcett Brown is a well-known commentator. So Mordecai didn't just come up with this on the top of his head. It was a custom that was already there. But what he was doing was taking these customs and quickly putting them together and say, this is what we'll do for the man you really want to honor. And by the way, who are you going to appoint to lead me around? You know, that was kind of what he was, you know, getting. You know. Well, let's read on. Verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone for all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Now, I don't know if it was a very big balloon that got punched with a little pin, or a very big balloon that got punched with a really big pin. But you can just see all the air go out of Haman. You can maybe even see him go white. Wait. What do you mean?
That wasn't what I thought.
No, you don't. You can almost see him say, no, 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 no. You made a mistake. No, 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 no. You mean put it on Haman, right? Talk about a slap in the face. I have to give Haman some credit, according to the story here, because he just went out and did it. Some men, may have decided to go jump off the city wall or something, rather than take that kind of embarrassment, because it's evident that the whole city pretty much knew that Haman hated Mordecai. But at the same time, that hatred was turned in Mordecai's direction, because as the man who hated him the most led him around, it became a greater honor than if somebody who had no feeling one way or the other for him was leading him around. You understand what I mean? The honor was actually multiplied because the one leading him was the one who hated him the most and held the highest position in the country. And here he is leading Mordecai around. Oh, you almost feel sorry for Haman. Almost. Almost. But not quite. As you can see, Haman, he's probably anxiously waiting for Ahasuerus to give the order to one of his servants to go bring in the next man in order under him, to lead him around. You can just see him waiting for that. And then, even the king says, here, take the robe, go get the horse. And maybe he's thinking, wow, yeah, I'll get it all together and then, get it on, and I'll put it on. Maybe I'll ride the horse out of the castle, and this is going to be great. And then he says, you take it and do it to Mordecai. Devastating. Devastating. All right, let's see what happened. Verse 12. Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. When Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. There's a couple of interesting things in here. Notice Mordecai. Now, he could have taken the day off. He could have, went around to all of his neighbors and said, did you see what happened? Did you see what happened? Wow, did you see how I was honored? He could have went to his family and said, did you see what happened? How I was honored? But instead, he just went back to work. What was important to me at Mordecai was not the honor that was put on him. What was important is the preservation of his people. His people were going to die. And he was not interested in his own self-honor, his own self-worth, or what anybody thought about him. It was important that he go back to work. And I think this is a lesson for us. Sometimes we want to get so wrapped up in what people think about us, how people picture us, how they honor us. And when we should really be concerned with, and our first priority should be those people that are dying. When we look at a doctor, what do we expect doctors to be? Their first priority should be what? Patients. Dying. Sick. Well, aren't we doctors? They minister to the flesh. We minister to the spirit. So shouldn't that be our number one concern? And yet we're so sometimes more interested in what people think about us than we are in what our work should be. And then we look at Haman. Haman went back to his house. He didn't go to work. He didn't go back into the court. He didn't bring his grand plan before Ahasuerus. He went home with his head covered. He was in mourning. Head covering was the first step in mourning in those days. We saw the last step, which was sackcloth, ashes, you know, and all of that, torn clothes. But before that, if it was just a minor, like terribly embarrassed, which he was, you just covered your head, and hoodie is the best way to describe it. You put a hoodie on, you know. And he went home. And he went home and had a pity party. He called his wife. He called his wise men, and he related the story. And this is where it really kind of gets interesting. The wise men were probably magicians. These were people who were supposed to be able to tell the future. Well, if that's the case, the advice they gave him in the first place was really off. I mean, that was the worst advice, and we'll find that out later. But he goes in, and so, but they make a very important statement. He said, and this was his wife, so perhaps she was also an oracle or a soothsayer, some kind of a magician either, with these other friends. She said this: if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall. Now, nothing had happened here up to this point. The king was still perfectly happy with Haman. He still had his position. There was nothing that would indicate that he was in any way falling out of favor with the king. In fact, the fact that he was chosen to lead that horse around merely said he was the highest official in the land. I mean, this was actually, should have been taken as an honor. Leading Mordecai, somebody he really wanted to honor. But to Mordecai, it was not because, to Haman, because he hated Mordecai. The fall was in his own heart, not actual things going on around him. It was his perception. And I'm just going to throw this in the world that we live in today. So much of the problems we're having is due to perception and not fact. Or facts that don't substantiate what is being accused or what is being said. But it's how we perceive things that makes them important. It's how we perceive them is how it affects us. But notice, she was not looking at it from Haman's point of view. She merely says, you're falling already. Hasn't happened yet, but you're falling already. You've already begun the fall. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent. Well, she knew he was, because she was already told him. You will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Now, this could have been spoken as a result of some omen that they've seen or some of their magic. But really, this period of time, there was already a considerable amount of history, oral history, on the Jews, and how God had protected them, how God had used them, how kings had been destroyed before this God of Israel. One of them was the king of Assyria, whom the Persians would be well aware of. And you'll remember our study where, especially in Isaiah, where they amassed a huge army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they came against Israel, and they took parts of Israel, and God said, I'm using you, But then this king, he decided he was going to go above and beyond that, and so he laid siege to Jerusalem. And God said, I didn't tell you to do that. And so in the night, over 100,000 soldiers died one time in the middle of the night. Just gone. His whole army wiped out. Sennacherib was the man's name. And one of the mightiest empires of his day. And he fled before the God of Israel. That was just one. When you read all the other exploits that God did for Israel and how all of these foreign kings were killed, Gog and just all of them, then you begin to understand that these people had a knowledge of Jehovah and what his power was. And he said, if he's a Jew and you're going against the Jews, forget it. You ain't going to have it. It's not going to happen. You're going to fall. All right. All right. So he's right in this conversation and he hears this dire prediction from his wife and his wise men, and then in come the messenger saying it's time to go to Esther's banquet. All right. Now we don't know what the demeanor of Haman was at this time. He was looking forward to the banquet. It was going to go with joy, but I'm not sure he was going with joy this time. He very well may have had a preconceived notion that he was in trouble. With the king, his wife, and the wise men saying you're going to fall. All of that probably played on him. And he was, I doubt, very happy and joyful going to Esther's banquet. But let's read about it in verse 1 of chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom, it shall be done. All right, so this is the second banquet. Now, if we read this and just look at it, it says the banquet lasted 2 days. But what that really means is it was the second banquet. It was the second day of banquets. So we had the first banquet on the first day, and this is the second day or the second banquet. And they had eaten the main course, and now they were sitting around eating dates and fruits and desserts and drinking wine. And so now the king again says, okay, here we are, this is the second day now. What do you want? You just asked me and it's yours. What is your petition? Your petition will be granted. And what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom and it'll be yours. All right, let's read verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. You know, if we're not careful, we miss something very, very important here. The king made 2 statements. What is our request? What is your petition and what is your request? They are not the same. The Hebrew words used for those two have a very different connotation. So let me go over this. First place, Esther's response was very well crafted, and it corresponded to the 2 questions that Ahasuerus asked. First one was, what is your petition? Now that's a word that's she'ela, and which comes from a root that means to ask, seek, or beg for. So her initial request or petition was, let my life be given to me. Let me have my life. That was a plea. She was asking, she was pleading, all right, for her life. Esther, first of all, pleads for her life. Now, when to answer the question about what she requests, request came from the word bakasha, which comes from a stronger root that means more to demand or require. I am pleading for my life, but I am requiring that my people be spared. You see the difference? It's very much like we see with Mordecai. She was not as concerned about her life. She could have said, I am pleading. I'm not going to plead, but I'm going to enter a request that you save my life and another request that you save my people. No. Or she could have reversed the two. I'm requiring that you save me, and I'm pleading for my people. I'm petitioning for my people. But she didn't do that. She put herself in more danger than the people. Because remember what he said. Whatever you say, I'll do. Whatever your petition is, and whatever your request is, I will give it to you. These were promises. So she could get bold about her people. She didn't get bold about herself, but she did about her people. I am requiring, I am demanding that you spare my people. Because you said you would. Whatever I ask, here it is. I'm demanding that that be it. She goes on to explain that her people, including her, had been sold with the purpose of destroying, killing, and annihilating everyone. Now there's another little thing here. Her use of the words was to stir up anger inside of Ahasuerus. She could have just said, we've been sold to be killed. But she goes on and on. It's not just killing, it's annihilating, it's destroying. It was to get him angry, stirred up and angry. I mean, this is one of the best crafted responses that we'll find anywhere to these kinds of questions. It was so well done. All right. Then she accuses someone of selling them, the Jews, without naming that person, who was the king himself. Because Haman had vowed to pay 10,000 talents of silver in exchange for the right to kill the Jews. So in effect, Ahasuerus had sold the lives of the Jews to Haman. And I don't think that fact was lost on Ahasuerus. She uses the word we. When she says, for we have been sold. And we, she includes herself. It would have been easier to say my people, but she puts herself in that place. Now, she had been so careful to guard this for a whole time she'd been queen, that she was a Jew. Now she lets it out with force. I'm part of them, and I'm going to be annihilated just like everybody else. She wanted to make sure that there was no mistake about her involvement. In the first statement, she uses me and my people. Me and my people. Then she comes back with the word we. All right, if they had been sold into slavery, she would have said nothing, even though it would mean the loss of her crown, her position, and her wealth. She would have lost everything if they had just sold them into slavery. And she makes something here that's an interesting statement. Although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. Some of the commentaries, and I think they make a mistake, none of them are infallible, but I think they get stuck on a little rut. But they're saying, well, that meant that because all of these people would be killed, it wouldn't compensate for the king's treasury. He'd lose too many people, he'd never be able to make it up. It wasn't worth the 10,000 talents, you know, and all of this. But she wasn't talking in this sentence about everybody being killed. She was talking about if they went into slavery. Because she would have lost her queenship. The loss to the king would have been because it's evident and that he loved Esther. In fact, it says so. He loved Esther. He put her above everybody else. He was willing to violate the law of the land, if you will, even though he had the right to tip the scepter. But, you know, he was willing to do all of that for her. And she would not be there because she'd be gone, a slave. The loss to him would have been greater than the financial gain that would have went into his treasury. Okay, that's my take. All right, let's move ahead. Now, this was probably, possibly anyway, the first time that Ahasuerus and Haman found out that Esther was a Jew. She kept it secret. So this may have been the first time. And then you can just kind of see Haman all of a sudden remembering what the wise men and his wife said. Not only are you coming against Mordecai, but you're coming against Esther, and they're both Jews. Uh-oh. All right, verse 5. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Oh boy. Ahasuerus asked the inevitable question that I'm sure Haman did not want to be asked, want him to ask, and that is, who is he and where is he? Esther had prepared the perfect plan. There was nobody there except Haman and Ahasuerus. There was nobody to stick up for Haman. There was nobody on his side. It was him and the king and Queen Esther and the eunuchs that were there. That was it. And so when the king said, "Who is he and where is he?" she knew exactly what the answer was before they ever had the banquet. He's sitting right beside you. Oh, what that must have done for Haman. Oh. Even Ahasuerus, who was considered an evil man in many ways, was appalled that anyone could have their heart so filled with hate that it could do such a thing. The word presume that we see here, when he asks, "Who dare presume this in his heart?" that word presume means to fill or to be full of what? Hate. How could anybody's heart be so full of hate that they would do this? And this was from a wicked king. I mean, annihilation was, you know, we talked about that the first week. Annihilation is something that was common in those days. Not real common, but, you know, genocide was something they just kind of did. Yeah. And even God recognized that. I mean, he said, "Go wipe everybody out." Men, women, children, animals, whatever, to wipe them out. It was kind of but it wasn't done from excessive hate in the heart. That makes the difference here. It may have been done for reasons, to defeat an enemy, to put down an insurrection, for whatever, but not just because somebody hates somebody else. And sometimes, because we allow hate to get into our hearts, while we don't physically annihilate people, we kill them spiritually by our hate, by the way that we address them, by the way that we put them down, by the way we ignore them. There's all kinds of ways that we can annihilate or kill people spiritually. And it's so important that we check ourselves all the time. What is in our heart? That's why God said, it's what's on the heart that counts. And we need to constantly watch our heart. Make sure that our heart is pure. David said, I want you to take and I want you to cleanse me. He meant his heart. Cleanse my heart with hyssop, which was a rough shrub that they used to scrub things. He says, cleanse me with hyssop. Scrub that stuff out of there. And then I'll be white as snow. All right. Esther answered Ahasuerus by using 3 words that were designed to make the king even angrier than he was. The first one was adversary, which means the human oppressor. And then the enemy. And this was a national enemy. You say, well, how could that be a national enemy? You take all the Jews out of the kingdom of Persia, it would have bankrupted them. There was a large population of Jews just in the castle itself, in the citadel. How would they have replaced all of those? Many of them were high officials. Where would all that knowledge go? So she was talking not only about the human oppressor, but also the national enemy. He's buying these things for his own hate, but it's going to bankrupt the nation. It's going to bring Persia down. And then the wicked, which means the worst enemy. The words that's used there. The worst enemy. Haman was shown to be all of these things. And of course, Haman became terrified as he stood before her, or was probably still on the bed, the couch, because they'd been eating, and they have the big pillow couches that they sat on and ate. He may have jumped up, but as he was there before the king and queen, he was terrified. He already knew what was coming. All right, verse 7. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So the anger of Ahasuerus was so great that he had to go out in the garden. And he of course, was angry about several things. He was angry at Haman for having tricked him. He was certainly angry at himself for being gullible enough to not look deeper into what Haman was trying to accomplish. And I think also he may have been angry at Esther for not revealing sooner that she was a Jew. Now there's no indication of that. This is just if I'm putting myself in Ahasuerus' position, I would have some anger that my queen was actually keeping something this important from me. Because in those days it was important to know lineage, genealogies. You know, you read through the Bible and, oh, this is so-and-so, son of such and such, who was a such and such, and they came from such and where. I mean, all this was common, and they needed to know all of this. If he opened the book of Chronicles, he would probably never see the genealogy of Esther there. She had kept that a secret. So there was no doubt some anger there about that. He shows a great deal of wisdom in not reacting, but in taking the time to go out in the garden, to cool down and think things over. And no doubt he was thinking, what am I going to do now? I just promoted this guy, he's the highest in the kingdom, and now I find out the guy is who the guy really is. I should have known this, you know, I shouldn't have, you know, what am I going to do? And I don't know, maybe he even was consulting with some of his servants out there. He seems to have done a lot of consulting with his servants. So maybe he was, I don't know. But when he returned from the garden, he found an interesting situation. While he was gone, Haman was now standing up. Esther is now stretched out on the pillow, and the table is there. They've been eating, drinking. And he's pleading for his life. And I don't think he was sitting there carrying on a debate, you know. Well, now, you know, Esther, that I really didn't, you know, I don't think it was that. He was terrified. He was pleading for his life. And I can see Esther just kind of sitting there looking at him. I don't think she said anything, you know. What's there to say? And finally, he did the customs of those days. When you really wanted something and weren't getting the answer you wanted, you grasped the feet of the person you're pleading with. You'll remember, or their garments. And you'll remember Jesus, when he was walking along, there came the little woman with the issue of blood. If I can just touch the hem of his garment. Normally that would have been if I can just grasp the hem of his garment and get his attention. You know, I'm pleading. She just looked at him. There's no record that she said anything. And then again, she may have just really told him off. But he was pleading with her, and in pleading he had to get down to grab her feet. And that's when King Ahasuerus came in. This doesn't mean he was laying across the couch. It means he was down low by the couch, or, you know, and probably down by her feet. But in those days, you did not touch nor come close to any of the king's wives or anybody in the harem, let alone the queen. You see, Haman was not because of what he did to Mordecai or tried to do. He was hanged because he got too close to the queen. Because Ahasuerus walked in and immediately saw the situation and said, would you assault the queen while I am in the house? Now, does that mean that if he wasn't there, it'd be okay? I don't know, you know. But I'm in the house, and here you are assaulting the queen. Now, that doesn't mean she was ripping her clothes off or anything like that. Assaulting was simply getting too close. That was considered an assault. And as soon as he said it, now I told you earlier, I thought that the servants and the chamberlains did not like Haman. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, they covered his face. They didn't ask. They didn't wait for the king to nod or to tell him. As soon as it was out of his mouth, would you assault the queen? Wham! He's got a veil on his face. He's got something covering his face. Now that seems kind of strange. Why would he cover his face, you know? Well, the reason is because in those days, the king would no longer have to see the face of a person he now loathed, and he was now considered a condemned person who was never again to see the light of day. Once a criminal was condemned, they covered his head, and that covering was never taken off. He never saw the light of day again. That's where probably the saying comes from, never seeing the light of day. And so in this situation, whether they used a towel, whether they had, who knows, they covered his face and they got him out of there. It would have been an affront to the king to have to see the face of Haman again. Verse 9. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." And the king said, "Hang him on it." Maybe I should say, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Now, it's quite probable that nobody had seen the gallows up until this point. Because remember, it was built that night. And this was early in the morning. And I can see the eunuch as he's standing there, and he looks out the window, and there's those gallows. And about that time, they throw the towel over his face, and here's this eunuch, and he says, "King, hey, look over there. There's the gallows that Haman built for Mordecai." Now tell me something, how did he know it was built for Mordecai? He just built them that night. What this says is that the rumor mill in those days was very quick and very good and very accurate. These servants, they had their own lines of communication. That thing was probably started to be built when it was already known to the eunuchs in the castle what was going on, all right? He said, there it is. That's the one that he's put up for Haman, or for Mordecai. The king maybe didn't know anything about it. Mordecai never said it, or Haman never said anything about it. Never got a chance. The eunuch knew, the king didn't. But the king probably looked out there at that thing. Hang him on it. That looks like a good one. 50 cubits high. That's huge. 75 feet. And of course it wasn't a rope. They impelled him up there. Stuck through. Nailed to that big old thing. And what's interesting, it was in front of his house. So every time his wife or the wise friends or his kids or anybody, and he had a lot of kids, we know, because he said he did. Every time they were around the house, look up, there's Dad. Can you imagine how that was, how that affected his family? When we do things against God, it doesn't always just affect us. It affects our family. It affects generations. And we know that from the Old Testament. So it's imperative that we're careful with what we do, and careful how we approach God and how we approach the things of God. Notice this, that after he was hanged, the wrath of Ahasuerus subsided. And that would have included the wrath against Esther. And also, I think it also has another little connotation, and that is that when God avenges, the wrath of man is taken and completed. In other words, he used a human to bring judgment on Haman. But when the judgment is complete, the wrath of the king was gone. Because God said, I will revenge. I will avenge. And he uses human nature or human people to do that. But he expects them to stop when he does that. To stop the anger. Any questions? No? No? Okay, that's it for tonight. One more week, and we got to